Hello, and welcome to the Equity Expert Podcast. I'm Jed Namazi. I'm the Director of Content for the NASPP, and today I'm joined by one of our longest-serving community members and leadership volunteers for the NASPP, John Barringer of Executive Wealth Planning. But before I get to him, I want to take a minute just to remind everybody that this episode is part of our Equity Expert podcast series, which features discussions with a variety of professionals on practices, trends, and career-related topics in the area of stock compensation. You can find this podcast series on the NASPP website, naspp.com, and also in streaming podcast apps like iTunes, Stitcher, and Spotify. So moving on to our guest and topic of the day, I want to share a little bit about John because we're really lucky to have him. I think he's going to have some great nuggets of information to share about just getting involved and leading a community. It's probably a variety of other nuggets as well. But let's just get his background. So John Barringer is a certified financial planner. He's got over 30 years of experience in the investment and wealth management industry. He is currently the managing partner for Executive Wealth Planning, where he specializes in helping high net worth executives and executives at public companies with investment management, retirement planning, and risk management. Some of you may also know John. You may have run into him during his years, and when I say years, I mean decades of leadership of the NASPP's Denver chapter. He is also a contributing editor at mystockoptions.com, and we will hear a lot more about him and some of the things he's been involved with as we chat. So I'm thrilled to be able to catch up with him, and I want to just gain some perspective on how community has played a role in his career. So welcome, John.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you. And I think just for the sake of the audience, you've obviously been in this industry with us for a while. You've been very involved with the NASPP for a while in our community. But let's just take it back to the beginning and kind of start where it all began and get to know you a little bit better from that perspective. So tell us a little bit about how you got started in equity compensation.
Well, I started as a stockbroker in 1986. In 1987, lots of you will know that the stock market famously crashed. And in 1988, my branch manager came to me with a copy of Jesse Brill's Corporate Executive. And he said, somebody sent this to me. I read it. I don't understand it. You might. And I read it, and it was interesting because it was talking about the upcoming amendment to Reg T at the Federal Reserve, which was the thing that made cashless exercise possible. And in a follow-up conversation with Jesse, we realized that there was a business opportunity here. So we began to seek out businesses in the Denver business community that had executives who had equity comp, stock options, non-qualified stock options then, and offered to help them exercise in this new way. I think, I can't say for certain because I don't know the back office operations of every brokerage firm in Denver, but I think that it's quite likely I did the first cashless exercise option in Denver. In order to service these people, we had to invent the process. There was no paperwork existing. There was no procedure in place. Nobody knew how to do this because it was all new. So I helped Dean Witter, brokerage firm that I was working for, develop procedures and a process to make exercises easy. And because of that, I was invited to be among the first group of what were called corporate services advisors when the firm eventually created a department to serve the executive compensation market in 1992.
Well, and I'm having throwback memories here. I wasn't in the industry quite at that time, but I do remember a lot of these processes. And ironically, the first broker that I worked with was also at Dean Witter as well, but another state. But I do remember the learning ropes of trying to figure out how to engage with these types of transactions, and a lot was new back in the day. So it sounds like you were at the forefront of that. And also sounds like somewhere along the way you got involved with the NASPP, and I want to point out to everybody that you were our one and only chapter president of the Denver chapter, basically from inception all the way until just a few months ago. And so really want to hear about how you got involved and what made you go down that path.
Well, like I said, I worked for Dean Witter. Jesse Brill, who lots of you will know is the founder of the NASPP, which was built on the back of a previously existing Silicon Valley loosely organized group of people in the back rooms of public companies there that were also trying to figure out how to go down this path of administering these plans. He was corporate counsel for Dean Witter back then, because we were then based in San Francisco. In, I think it was 1991, he reached out to brokers within the organization like me who were doing this kind of business, but more who were doing Rule 144 business. Administering 144 trades was a very hands-on, paperwork intensive process that only certain advisors were allowed to do because the firm didn't want people to screw it up. So those of us that had gone through the training and were doing that were known to the department that Jesse was attached to, so he knew who we were, and he reached out and asked us to start a local chapter of this new organization he had created. And the first event was a Romeo and Die Section 16 update that was broadcast to TV stations around the country via closed circuit. So ours was at the local PBS affiliate, and most of the attendees there were securities lawyers, in-house counsel for public companies, probably a few outside counsel as well, but they were there to get CLE for their attendance, and they were encouraged to bring their best clients to the second day of what was a 2-day event. And I brought everybody sandwiches for the lunches, and we turned the second day's lunch into a chapter meeting. And there were maybe a dozen public companies there, some typical big names from Denver, and a few I had been working with through that hands-on process I described earlier, but others were new. Some of those companies that agreed to have their representatives get together in that very first meeting and become members are still companies that are members today. And there was one other member who was there that day, my friend Roberta Lewis, and she eventually was my first board member, and she also retired this year at the end of 2020. So that was the beginning. We didn't really know what we were doing, but we gathered together in a group to talk about it.
Well, it's amazing to me how some of these things are just so organic. One thing leads to another, and then before you know it, you've got a chapter, and then fast forward, decades later, and that chapter is going strong and a great resource to the stock plan community. And I just appreciate everything that you have done to support that growth. And Roberta as well, like I have to recognize her as well for her long service to the chapter. So I want to get to the middle parts of kind of running a chapter and some of your experience there, and really just kind of how being part of a community has influenced you and affected you in your career. But I'm going to kind of jump to the end for a minute. So I want to just talk and recognize again that you really did lead the Denver chapter and that community for an incredibly long time. And I'll say to our audience, it's not always easy running a chapter, as we're going to find out, but obviously you found something in you and some inspiration to really stay in that role and continue to grow and lead the chapter to what it has become today, decades later. And so I want to just ask you to share a little bit about what was that inspiration and how did you find the motivation to stay in that role?
Well, at that first meeting, like I said, there were a group of people whose job description included responsibility for managing this stock plan benefit for their executives. Most of them had ended up with the job. They hadn't actually volunteered directly for it. Their boss told them that you need to do this. You need to come up with procedures to manage it. Some of them had built spreadsheets to try to keep track of their people. Others had other kinds of processes in place. And we had this camaraderie built around a somewhat panicked need to understand how to do the job better. So I really enjoyed working with people that I met in human resources, the corporate secretary's office, treasury, compensation, whatever department the company decided to house stock compensation function in. And like I said, a lot of these people didn't really have much guidance for how to do the job they were doing, since it was actually pretty new. Before Reg T was amended and before it was easy to cashlessly exercise a stock option, and at this point, 91 or 92, we're not too far beyond that, it was somewhat cumbersome for somebody who'd received some sort of equity compensation from their employer actually take advantage of it. The companies didn't necessarily finance it. People couldn't necessarily go to the bank and borrow the money to pay for their option exercise. The company didn't necessarily have a process in place. And a lot of companies just didn't do it because it was excessively complicated. And for companies that did it, a lot of them didn't do it broadly because the rank and file members didn't appreciate the complexity in face of what they weren't really sure the benefit might be. So because there was not much guidance, I found myself as a resource for these people, which was really rewarding. And honestly, it was a good source of new business, since there weren't any other advisors that knew anything about Section 16 or Rule 144, or even had the slightest idea of how to help an executive exercise an option. And if they had heard of it, they certainly hadn't developed the paperwork and process to deal with it. Even people in my own office who stumbled across the business would find themselves having to come to me to have me help them walk through the process. And in the process, among all those people, I made some really great long-term friendships. So running a chapter with a bunch of your friends, it wasn't that much heavy lifting. It was fun.
Well, that's one thing I always have appreciated about the chapters is that sense of community. And, when you have the right community or the right people on your team kind of working with you, it seems like there is a lot of the fun or the positive interpersonal rewards that come with that. So I know there's challenges in leading a chapter. I want to just ask you to touch on, what were some of the greatest challenges for you in leading a chapter?
Well, there are a bunch of relatively mundane challenges that face every chapter. Finding places to hold meetings, that's a big challenge. Companies don't necessarily want to just give up boardroom space or dedicate it to something that they can't just cancel at the last minute, use it for something else. There's not a lot of affordable public space where you can hold a meeting. So our challenge was finding places to do meetings. In the beginning, because the geography of Denver is very spread out, like California is spread out, like the East Coast is spread out. But in the case of Denver, we were kind of this chapter out here in the West with the wagons in a circle. The closest chapter was in California or maybe Texas or maybe Minnesota. So there's this big open plot of geography in the middle of the country that had members dedicated to it. So we had members all up and down the Front Range of the Rockies, from Colorado Springs to Fort Collins, or even from New Mexico to Wyoming. And then there were people on the other side of the mountains. Some of the ski areas are a part of public company conglomerates, and they're in the mountains, or were then. And then we even had a couple of companies out in Nebraska. So the challenge for the administrators themselves, which turned into a challenge for the chapter, is they weren't, as I said earlier, they were sort of volunteered or assigned to this position. They weren't really considered the professionals that they are today. They weren't paid like executives. They didn't control their own schedule. And we were asking some of them to drive an hour or more to attend a meeting. I know that if you live in New Jersey or DC, or you live in Los Angeles, you're used to driving an hour to go somewhere. But in Denver, driving an hour was considered a burden. And it was a burden enough that a free lunch wasn't always enough of an incentive to get them to come. We tried breakfast meetings. We tried happy hours. For a while, we had a semi-permanent space at Charles Schwab's office. So that made it convenient because it got into a routine of being able to use and schedule that space. But then their policies changed and we went on hunt for additional space. Because in spite of these challenges, in spite of the relatively low reward inherent in a free lunch, we were building a pretty good membership roster because the members talked to other people they knew doing the same job at another company, or they changed companies. And the word got out that this was a great networking resource for people that did this job. And we were beginning to have, by the mid 90s, we were starting to have meetings that were 50 to 60 people. Occasionally we'd get somebody from another part of the country who came to one of our meetings, and they'd say, wow, we never get this many people. So we didn't know that we were doing a great job. We were just, trying to be a great resource for each other. And the elements of a good meeting were, a free location that was easy to get to, where you didn't have to pay to park, and it was centrally located. And in the early years, I paid for the lunches. I was getting customers out of the company customers out of the deal, so the lunch was a deductible expense for me. And the organization hadn't really come around to believing that having sponsors of meetings was a good idea. It wasn't really the norm for the chapter to get a brokerage firm or a consulting firm to pay for the meeting. It was actually rather contentious issue that we discussed at chapter officers meetings. Dan Walter, who some of you probably know from his long involvement with NASPP, was at the time of one meeting, he was the New York, New Jersey chapter president. And during a meeting, I can't remember where we were. We might have been in Las Vegas, we might have been in San Francisco, but I have a vision of the room in my head, and we're all sitting around a big table in a room, and the discussion is, how do you pay for meetings? And Dan and I are saying, well, we just, we get a broker to pay, we get a Deloitte or somebody else like that to pay. And there was an uproar because how do you prevent it from turning into a sales pitch? And aren't those vendors going to capture the chapter? And we didn't see it as a problem. And eventually we prevailed, because it's pretty normal these days for meetings to be paid for by a sponsor. But it's funny that as part of the growing pains of the organization, it wasn't really clear how we were going to pay for the kind of growth that we were trying to create for these chapters. Today, it's a much more simple process and much more straightforward. We just ask them for an outline of what they're going to say. We have somebody who's a CEP in the chapter say, yeah, this looks like something that would probably be valuable as continuing ed. We submit that to the CEP. We organize the meeting, and the people show up. They might hand out some business cards, but they don't give us a sales pitch. And a time or two where we got a sales pitch, those people never came back because the members were there to get educated. And the more educational content we could provide them, and the more their time commitment was perceived by them to be worthwhile, the more likely they were to want to attend. So, we managed. The administrators were really desperate for how-to information, and the how-to presentations really were central to the strategy of attracting people to meetings. I've met some really, in fact, all the really smart people that I know that are in this business, I've met by trolling for good speakers and timely topics. And there's a lot of salespeople in our industry. And then there's this relatively short list of really smart, innovative, competent, capable people. And we've had those people come and talk to us repeatedly. And it's great to know who those people are. So that's a reward feedback that keeps you motivated. Big problem these days with chapter content is trying to figure out something that's new. In the early days, it was all new. When we had Sarbanes-Oxley, there were a lot of new regulations. From time to time, the SEC or Congress or somebody will change some rules, and that's always good because people are anxious to know how that's going to affect their job. But there hasn't been a lot of that lately. And so the big challenge for the board lately is trying to find new, interesting content. As I said earlier, or alluded to earlier, we organize our content around CEP continuing education credits. The CEP has just been really, really important, as I'm sure you would agree, to building the profession and tying continuing ed to chapter meetings. It has just grown into a natural fit. We now have dozens of CEPs in the community, and they're regulars at the meetings. So it's evolved over the years from a whole bunch of us not really knowing what the heck we were doing to a group of people who were really focused on improving professionalism and competence. And when everybody's kind of on the same page, it's pretty easy to put together meetings and presentations.
Well, and I'm sensing that theme, that really having a strong team dynamic, especially on your board or just those who are volunteering or contributing, it just seems that, whatever the challenge is, you figure it out together, which makes it easier, but also just kind of bonds you together as you grow.
Right.
And I echo what you said about the CEP. It was very instrumental in my own career development early on when I had no idea what was going on in equity compensation, was thrown in the role. It definitely helped me to learn many of the things that I needed to learn, and the continuing education aspects, and just continuing to grow. Even if you're not a CEP, I think there's so much to continue to learn from, and things continue to evolve and things change. So let's just turn to some of the lighter. I know you've touched a lot on that you really enjoyed the group of people that you worked with and who were involved with the chapter, and just in general the stock plan community and those who really kind of help support a lot of the endeavors of growth over the years. So I'm just going to ask you, stepping back into that, what were some of the things that you enjoyed the most about being involved with the community and the chapter in your area?
Well, the networking was really good for business. So there's that. But as I said before, the people that I met were the reason that I enjoyed it. It was rewarding to believe that I was building something that would have a life after I left it. So there was this community of people that had been able to come together around an effort that I started and it sustained. The board in Denver now is made up of some really talented, knowledgeable people, and I'm proud I was able to find and keep them. There's a lot of satisfaction in that process, like there was when I was a brokerage firm branch manager. When you're leading people and you're successful in helping them build their career. And it's like being a teacher or a professor or any sort of a knowledge leader. It's its own reward. It's really rewarding to see people thrive within the context of an organization that you build.
All right, let's turn to, you were a chapter leader. You were for a long time, and you've talked about, just going through the process of having to figure things out and really start from scratch and kind of learn as you go. And so that had to have had impact on, just your growth in general, whether it was personal or career related. And I know we've talked about, in some ways it was good for business, but I'm guessing that there were also just some general takeaways that you were able to learn. And I'd love to put that out there, or I'd love for you to put that out there as to kind of what those were, because I feel, there's a lot of new chapter presidents or people stepping into the kind of the community engagement, and it's kind of like, we can tout it all and say, yeah, you will become part of a community and you'll learn and you'll grow, but I feel like you've done that, and you've done that over a long period of time, and so would really love to hear how that impacted you.
Well, I don't know for certain that my experience is going to translate into an experience that could be replicated by somebody else. But what I'll say is that heading up the chapter, I made the decision to weave equity compensation and the running of the chapter as an essential element of my business model. I ended up spending virtually my entire career working with equity compensation clients. In any profession, a specialization is likely to pay better and be more rewarding than doing something general or not specific. If you're able to build an expertise, I personally think that's a rewarding career path element. My financial planning focus steered me additionally to eventually connect with a software company, Net Worth Strategies, that developed a leading equity compensation modeling tool that's used by numerous advisory firms. So there again, an opportunity that you stumble across to help a special tool get developed in an industry that you are growing your career in is an opportunity that has meaning. Not only do you create a tool for others to use, but you create a tool that you can use in your own business. You think back to how shared data started off in Silicon Valley and eventually turned into E-Trade's Equity Edge. I think Cheryl Breitwar was the original executive at Share Data. She's got a whole career built around the success of focusing on equity compensation. That's greatly rewarding. And then, of course, my connection to Jesse Brill through the corporate executive and through NASPP and through initially Dean Witter and later Morgan Stanley, that's been a valuable professional relationship that was nurtured by virtue of being continuously involved in NASPP. And through NASPP, I met Bruce Brumberg, and that led me to be involved with mystockoptions.com from its very inception as an author and an editor, writing about something that you know a lot about and that you're perceived as an expert about. That's another feedback loop that leads to success. So being a chapter leader by itself isn't the entire measure of the reward, but being a chapter leader was part of connections to a lot of other moving parts that made 3-decade plus career specializing in equity comp and financial planning for executives possible.
I love that you say it kind of connected you to other moving parts. I think, sometimes the term volunteering or, even leading a chapter, it can sound intimidating, or, people aren't really sure how to get involved or what that means. And it might even sound more overwhelming than it actually will be in the end. And so I really would love for you to just throw out some advice or tips to others who are thinking, well, I might be interested in volunteering or getting more involved or engaged in my community, whether it's with the NASPP or other facets of the industry. But what would you say to those people who are interested and looking to become more engaged?
Well, if as I said earlier, I was a branch manager and I've trained dozens and dozens and dozens of stockbrokers to be stockbrokers, and only a few of them ended up in equity comp. They end up doing other kinds of specialties, but you only have success in a career in this industry to the extent that you're able to network and communicate with and learn from other people. And for equity comp, the local chapter is the best way to get connected to the community of stock plan professionals in any large city. If you want to network, this is the organization to do it. You know, there's the corporate secretaries, there's what World at Work is called these days. I forget what that is. There's the payroll association. There's a lot of tangential organizations, and those all have volunteer opportunities associated with them too. But the thing that makes them different is the difference in area of specialization. But the thing that makes them the same is that it's a community. And if you want to build a career, I think you have to build a career within a community. You can't build a career as a lone wolf. As an example, over the years, our chapter has facilitated the growth of lots of members by helping them change jobs. Being part of the board of a local chapter means you're part of a team made up of the most motivated subset of the stock plan community. And that would be true if you were a member of any of these other organizations. The people that volunteer are the people that are really motivated. And yeah, there's some work involved, but anything worthwhile, anything that's going to advance your career involves some work. And those connections to those highly motivated community people, that's what really helps you grow. And yeah, you have to be willing to contribute. We have telephone conference call board meetings, so you don't actually have to go anywhere. But we do ask chapter members, chapter board officers to come to meetings. Or well, we did when we were having in-person meetings. But even now, when there's Zoom meetings, we ask them to participate. So you have to do some work, but anything worth doing is worth participating in to the extent that you can contribute. And if you don't feel motivated to take the time and effort to contribute in that way, it's likely that somebody else will. And those people that will get promotions and they'll get new business opportunities. And if you're not willing to jump in and contribute a little bit, you probably aren't going to. So every single person that has presented themselves as being willing to contribute to the chapter, I've always said yes to. Can I help organize a meeting? Can I join the board? Can I sponsor a meeting? The answer is yes, yes, yes. You can do all those things because an organization needs people that want to get stuff done.
Well, I love all of this, and I love that it really goes back to, you want to volunteer or you want to contribute something, we're happy to have you do that, and it allows the chapter to benefit, and it takes some of the load off of, you in terms of carrying all of the responsibilities, and then it also allows them to feel good about plugging in and engaging and offering something to their peers, and there's a lot of good that comes around from that, it seems. So just on that note, I want to just segue into over time, sometimes it's like a community can stagnate, right? Like maybe, and you mentioned this earlier, even just getting new content sometimes can be challenging and kind of keeping things fresh. And so how do you continue to grow a community or continue to engage the people that are part of that community? I'd love to hear your thoughts, just having so much experience in probably those ebb and flows over the years. What's the next phase? How do we continue to keep that growing and alive?
Well, there's some Malthusian limits to growth. in everything. In Denver, our limits are set around some conditions that keep the community of public companies at somewhere around 100, and it just doesn't get any bigger than that. But over the last 3 decades or so, we tried everything to grow the chapter. Like I said, we dealt with logistics. We tried different meetings at different times of the day. We did polls, we did outreach, all the kinds of stuff that organizations do to try to figure out who's a potential member, where do they work, what can we do to get them to join. But organic growth is the only thing that really seems to work dependably. I think chapters grow best by using the existing members' contacts to network with other organizations in the community. So like I said earlier, the corporate governance professionals, the payroll association, that it's called the Total Rewards Association now, that used to be called World at Work. And we even networked with the Bar Association Securities subsection. There's probably others, but those are the ones that we had the most success with. There's always a few chapter members, or maybe just one, who are part of another professional association. So you might be a member of the NASPP, but you might be on the board of the Payroll Association, or you might be on the board of some human resources organization. A board needs to actively seek out those people by asking during the course of a meeting, who's on other boards, who's on a member of other associations, what other groups do you network in? Come talk to me about it. When we had in-person meetings, I would always work the room and make sure that I introduced myself to people whose faces I didn't recognize, like being my regular stockbroker salesperson personality of trying to work the room. But somebody needs to do that, needs to figure out who these people are and who do they know and what their other network of people is, so you can interact. It's somebody in the board organization in a chapter needs to be in charge of doing that outreach, not just to those members, but to the organizations themselves. All the information about who's on the board is available on their website. Look them up, see if you recognize any names, call them up, say, I'm on the board of the Cincinnati NASPP chapter. Let's have a cup of coffee. Share speakers, share meeting times. Other organizations have the same challenges as our organization. So some of them have solved it by having a meeting in the same place all the time. Others struggle to find places to have meetings. Others struggle to keep leadership in place. I mean, it's a normal thing for a professional association to have these ebbs and flows that you alluded to. You can offer co-membership deals. We'll invite your membership and you invite our membership. And if your thing is something that you have to pay to go to, let us pay the member price instead of the visitor price or something like that. Whatever might motivate their members to either attend a meeting, join a mailing list, or refer people at our chapter to local companies who have people who'd be interested in attending. If the content, we talked about content earlier, if the content of the meeting is good, somebody that came as a guest, somebody came for the first time, they'll come again, especially if you get them to join the email list. Part of the other business that I always used to put into my little thank you speech at the end of a chapter presentation was to remind members to bring their colleagues, bring their staff, bring their boss to any meeting that they thought would contain information that was relevant to his or her job or to your job that you think they should know more about. If you're bringing your boss, it's managing up. If you're bringing your staff, it's just managing. We had an open door policy, an extra sandwich was not going to be that big of a deal. And if that person is impressed enough with the presentation, they may join, or they may at least become a regular attendee. And then we had an annual open board meeting. By open, I mean, it wasn't just the board members. We told any member that wanted to come. And The idea was to encourage anyone who thought they had something to contribute to participate. And we identified a lot of board members over the years because they came to those meetings and they had an idea and they seemed enthusiastic about contributing in some way, or something about them encouraged me to say, hey, why don't you join the board? It's important to listen to those voices because a board of any sort of an organization can become kind of insular if the leadership isn't careful. And getting ideas, new ideas, is essential if you're going to have healthy organic growth over time.
Well, I appreciate all of this great insight into how to run a chapter and really just how to run a community and engage people and have a spirit of contribution and all of that coming from the perspective of a leader. And so I want to you recently, after so many years of running the Denver chapter and growing that community, you decided it was time to pass along the reins to a new president. And I want to just kind of look at what's next for you. What are you working on now, and what's your focus these days, and what's next for John and his journey?
People ask me, including clients, ask me, "Are you ever going to retire?" And I ask myself that question. There've been some times in my career, like in 2008 when the market stunk, or in 2001 after 9/11, when you say, "Geez, can't wait to retire." But after you live through a number of those cycles, you realize that you're fortunate to have this career path that allows you to continue to work as long as your cognition is functioning. So I still have an advisory practice, executive wealth planning. We advise public company employees on equity compensation and retirement planning. I continue to consult with Net Worth Strategies, the software company that I mentioned earlier, and I'm on the advisory board at mystockoptions.com. I expect to continue to stay busy. My professional focus is more on financial planning for executives and not so much on plan design or administration anymore. I personally would like to get the brokerage, asset management, advisory, whatever you call it, profession to offer more expertise in the advice that executives below the C-suite receive. The financial planning profession doesn't really include very many advisors who specialize in equity compensation. There's a lot of specialists in retirement, there's specialists in divorce, there's specialists in special needs, there's various product specialists, but equity compensation is still a pretty rarefied practice area. I'm a CFP, but the curriculum of the Certified Financial Planner and the certification exam is woefully short on anything that has to do with earned income related planning. Like I said, there's retirement planning, there's investments, unearned income kind of strategies, but nothing really about managing the thing that most everybody has, which is getting paid at work. Not just the paycheck, but the tax consequences, deferred comp, benefits, all that kind of stuff. Industry research shows that there's thousands of plan participants who don't fully understand their equity grants. They don't participate in the ESPP. They don't understand how their deferred comp plan works. They're confused about what will happen when their company IPOs. That's all compensation related. And there's a shortage of advisors who can help with common financial planning topics like retirement or divorce when it requires coordinating with your equity comp. So the specialists that do exist have this blind spot when it comes to equity. I've been lucky enough to participate in several conferences that target independent advisors who want to expand their expertise in this practice area, and I write for several sites, websites on these topics. So I expect to continue to do that. And then, of course, I plan to stay connected to the local NASPP chapter so I can stay in touch with my friends.
Well, I'm glad you're still got plenty to do in this industry, and I'm sure whatever you continue to do, there'll be great benefit from that, from everything you've got to contribute. And everything you have contributed. John, I really appreciate you taking time to just chat for a little bit and share some of your learnings and insights. And I'm so glad to hear that we'll be able to see you at the local NASPP chapter meeting.
I just want to say thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I've enjoyed myself. Thanks again.
Well, great. And to everybody, we will see you all on the next podcast.